The wind is cutting. Your fingers stopped working an hour ago. In your hand is a wooden shaft, tipped with a piece of stone you spent 3 days shaping. You are about to use it to kill something that weighs 6 tons. You are not running, because running means your children don't eat. Not tonight, not the night after. This was not adventure. This was the only option available. For most of human history, the alternative to hunting was dying. And the thing standing between those two outcomes was a mammoth. Long before civilization, before metal, before the written word, humans hunted the largest animals that ever walked the frozen earth. The question that took archaeologists a century to answer is how? Because the math doesn't work. A creature that size, that armored, that powerful, and you are holding a pointed stick. On paper, humans had no business surviving this interaction. The Stone Age lasted 3.3 million years. That is not a chapter in human history, that is almost the entire book. Every day of it began with the same question. How do we eat? How do we not die? There were no farms, no stored food, no backup plan. 25 people sleeping on hide-covered grass, everything they owned in a single bag, and the world outside was actively trying to kill them. For thousands of years, multiple human species shared the same territory as woolly mammoths, Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, all of them hunting the same animal, all of them competing for the same future. The last woolly mammoths died roughly 4,000 years ago. The pyramids of Egypt were already standing. The ancient world looked nothing like the one we imagine. And for most of that ancient world, humans were not the apex predator. They were somewhere in the middle of the food chain, trying not to get eaten while figuring out how to eat. A woolly mammoth was 3.5 meters tall, 6 tons of muscle and bone, a coat of fur so thick that Arctic blizzards couldn't reach the skin beneath it, tusks stretching 3 meters, capable of flipping a full-grown human into the air. The trunk alone had 40,000 individual muscles, more precise than a human hand, more powerful than anything a human could produce. This animal was not prey, it was a fortress that moved, and it had spent millions of years evolving to survive. The cold, predators, scarcity, every system in its body was built for endurance. The only thing it had never encountered was a creature that planned. A single mammoth could sustain an entire tribe, meat for weeks, hide for clothing and shelter, bones dense enough to build with, tusks long enough to frame a structure. One kill changed everything about the next few months. That is why you picked up the spear. Not for the kill, for the people back at camp who had no other option. The herds moved like slow mountains across the frozen plains, the calves tucked between the adults, the bulls at the edges, swinging tusks, and on a ridge somewhere above them, barely visible, a group of humans was watching, counting, waiting. The hunt started with patience. It started with information. A good tracker could read a mammoth print the way you read a sentence. How old, how heavy, whether the animal was limping. Until the 1980s, scientists believed early humans were scavengers, picking at carcasses left by larger predators. They had no evidence for it, it was simply assumed. Then archaeologists actually looked at the bones. Stone spearheads, shaped by human hands, were found physically embedded in mammoth bone. Not near the animal, in it. These creatures were not discovered dead, they were brought down deliberately. Chemical analysis of Neanderthal remains confirmed they were not scavengers. They were heavy, consistent consumers of large game. Mammoth meat was a staple. The scavenger theory collapsed under its own evidence. Neanderthals were built for close contact, stocky, dense muscle, enormously strong. They used thrusting spears. Getting in close enough to use one meant absorbing the animal's full attention at point-blank range. Many of them died doing it. Homo sapiens were lighter. They thought differently. They invented distance, throwing spears first, then the atlatl, which could launch a projectile hard enough to punch through hide at 30 meters. Then, eventually, the bow. They did not need to be stronger. They needed to stay out of reach and keep hitting until the animal stopped. Stone spearheads took days to produce. You started with a core rock and struck it with a hammerstone to split a flake. Then you shaped the edge with a bone tool, removing material in controlled strikes until the blade held an edge sharper than modern steel. Then you lashed it to a shaft with wet leather strips. When the leather dried, it contracted. It gripped the blade like a fist and would not let go. This was not primitive technology. This was engineering done with nothing but time and skill. Some arrows were tipped with poison drawn from plant sap. You didn't need the kill shot, you needed first contact. Then you followed and waited. The animal did the rest. The evidence for this is physical and scattered across 3 continents. Spear points buried in bone, kill sites with the remains of dozens of animals concentrated in one location. The archaeology is unambiguous about what these humans were capable of. A healthy adult bull was essentially impossible to take on directly, so the hunters selected for weakness. A calf separated from the herd, an older animal slowed by age or injury, an individual pushed to the edge of its social group. This was not cowardice. Targeting weakness was intelligence applied to the problem of survival. The hunters who chose winnable fights lived longer. They came back. They hunted again, Drive hunting. The method appears across dozens of archaeological sites from France to Siberia. Scouts located a herd near a cliff or a ravine. The hunters formed a line and moved in. Fire, noise, screaming, stones. The mammoths stampeded. The ground ended. The fall did the killing. The hunters collected the meat from the bottom. It was not elegant, but it worked at a scale no single animal hunt could match. Where there were no cliffs, hunters drove them into bogs. 6 tons of animal sinking slowly into soft earth. The more it struggled, the deeper it went. When the mobility was gone, the hunters moved in close. And sometimes the traps were narrow valleys where the animal could not turn around. Hunters along the cliff tops, throwing from above. The mammoth with nowhere to go and no angle to charge. Then the animal understood what was happening. The calm disappeared, 6 tons of fury spinning toward whatever was closest. One swing of those tusks could open a man from shoulder to hip. One stomp ended things the same way stepping on a branch ends the branch. There was no margin. If you froze for a second, you died. And the only reason you didn't freeze is that you had trained for exactly this moment your entire life. The hunt only looked like chaos. Every person had a role. One group distracted, using fire and noise to keep the animal's attention. Another group drove, directing its movement. A third waited for the angle to land the wound that would decide the fight. If one person panicked, the whole formation collapsed. The animal would identify the gap and go through it. The person who ran first was usually the person who died first. The strike team moved in from the blind spots. Spears driven into the hide behind the shoulder again and again. The person behind you was covering the angle you couldn't see. You were trusting them with your life. Not metaphorically, a badly wounded mammoth still fought. The tusks kept moving, the feet kept stamping. A dying animal that weighed 6 tons was still capable of killing every person in the group. If you did not trust every single person beside you completely, you did not hunt mammoths. You hunted rabbits and hoped that was enough. Then it was over. The ground stopped shaking. Nobody cheered immediately. Because what had just happened was not a sport and it was not entertainment. What had just happened was survival. And that demanded something quieter than a celebration. The real work began after the kill. Processing a carcass that weighed several tons required every available hand and could take 2 full days. Nothing was fast about it. Nothing was optional. The fat was stripped first. In the Ice Age, fat was the most valuable substance on Earth. More calories per ounce than anything else available. It was the difference between surviving winter and not surviving it. The hide was scraped clean and stretched to dry. The bones were sorted by size and purpose. The tusks were reserved. In the economy of the Ice Age, every part of the animal was currency. The bones became architecture, skulls for foundations, ribs stacked into walls, tusks bent into roof frames. These were not caves. These were structures built from the bodies of the thing you had hunted, and they stood through winter after winter, and then came the feast. The whole camp, children who had been waiting for days, elders who had eaten almost nothing, meat over a fire that burned all night. The story of the hunt was told that night, and it got a little more heroic with every telling. For one warm moment in the middle of the Ice Age, the world felt manageable. Hunting mammoths required communication advanced enough to plan across days, leadership complex enough to assign roles and hold them under pressure, and a level of trust so deep you would bet your life on the person standing next to you. It didn't just feed humans, it is part of what made humans. The decline started roughly 21,000 years ago. It was not one cause. It was a convergence, a perfect collapse of every factor that had previously been survivable in isolation. The climate shifted. The vast frozen grasslands that mammoths had lived on for millions of years began to disappear. Forests replaced tundra. The open space that made a mammoth-sized animal viable started shrinking year by year, century by century. And at the same time, the human population was rising. More eyes, more hunters, more groups converging on the same territory from multiple directions. Biology, climate, and us. Any single one of those forces might have been survivable over enough time. All three at once were not. The mammoths had survived everything before. They had not survived us. The last mammoths held on at Wrangel Island, a frozen strip of land in the Arctic Ocean, a small, isolated population. And then one day the last one died. Nobody marked it. Nobody was there to notice. The world simply moved on. 10 million woolly mammoths, reduced to 0. The dominant megafauna of the Ice Age, built for endurance across millions of years of evolution, simply stopped existing. But what remains is one of the most complete survival stories ever excavated from the ground. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans stood in the shadow of something vastly more powerful than themselves and found a way to come out the other side. Not because they were stronger, not because they were faster, because they planned, because they worked together, and because they kept coming back. Deep in caves across France and Spain, painted by firelight 30,000 years ago, the images are still there. Mammoths, hunters, spears in flight, hands pressed flat against stone, an act of documentation from people who had no alphabet. They could not write, but they recorded what mattered, and what mattered, over and over, was the hunt. The thing they had built themselves around. the thing that had made them who they were. Armed with nothing more than stone, fire, and a shared trust in one another, they stood in the freezing darkness, faced the largest animals on Earth, and turned that encounter into the foundation of everything that came after. That foundation is still holding. The tools changed, the prey changed, the stakes changed, but the core of it, planning together, trusting each other, refusing to quit, that part did not change. It never needed to. Every time something looked impossible to the people who came before us, they looked at it the same way those hunters looked at the mammoth on the frozen plain, not as a wall, as a problem that had not been solved yet. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they were right about that one. And the last cave painting of a mammoth, pressed into stone by a hand that has been dust for 30 millennia, is not a record of a hunt. It is a record of who we decided to be, and we have never fully walked away from that decision.